that's not me playing drums. It's a collection of one-shots programmed inside Ableton. I wanted to do something a little bit differently today because I recently heard Xander's new song, Complete, and I thought we can program some drums like that. So this is something that I don't think I've really seen on YouTube before, but if you've seen it, definitely point me in the direction. We're focusing on drums today, so we're not really looking at the musical elements, but if you're curious, I've just chopped up some piano samples from Splice, a little bit of OTT, Utility, EQ8, and then the Waves GW piano series, just to get it a little bit more in keeping with my sample. Done the same with a bass. Took ages to pitch each of these elements individually to get them in keeping with the piano, and then just some MIDI piano to play in live. With this particular sound, you're going to want to take your time. Sound selection is vital. So make sure, whether it be YouTube, BandLab, Splice, wherever you get your samples from, make sure that each sound is in keeping with the next. It's going to be a fairly tedious progress because you're trying to program something that should fool the listener into thinking it's real. Therefore, you're going to need to program all of the accidental background sounds, and you need to program that humanistic feel of making things be a little bit off grid, a little bit early, a little bit late. With that said, we're going to start off with our kick drum. For every one shot we're using, I'm normally looking for an acoustic kit sound. So no lo-fi drill trap sounds that are from an electronic kit. The first thing that I wanted to do was just EQ that kick drum there. So making sure that I'm really pulling out the frequencies that I want. If we're double clicking on this sample as well, I'm warping a lot of these samples by beats, preserving the transients, setting it to forward, and then pulling that envelope back. It's going to be different for each one shot, and with this particular kick drum I'm pitching it down -4 semitones, but you can see from kick drum to kick drum I'm pitching the sense a little bit differently. Even though this is subtle, it's going to give a more unique feel, because if you was to record a real acoustic kick drum with the change in pressure of the pedal on the skin, it's going to have a slightly different pitch. After this, I moved to something that was fairly easy, which was the open hi-hat. Open hi-hat isn't doing anything particularly special, but I'm tuning it with my drums, and I felt like -26 sounded a little bit better than the original sample. And this is a different hi-hat sound as well, taking the gain down and pitch to -30. There's nothing on that open hi-hat other than EQ, which is going to be the case for a lot of these sounds, as we're going to process them as a group, and they're all really lovely samples that came from Splice. Got these other kind of semi-open hi-hats as well. These are going to be accented with ghost notes, so you imagine the drummer taking the pressure off of the hi-hat pedal a little bit and making kind of a buzzy sound with the hat. Again, EQ down here being really specific. So you can tell that some of these hi-hats are a little bit more breathy than the last. I want to give that really unique feel. And we're obviously coupling that with some downbeat hi-hats. The hi-hat samples here were taken from a really long drum groove. What I needed to do was chop out the individual hi-hat samples and then sweep off any low frequencies. I put these on 2 tracks because I kind of wanted those loud accented hats on one track, and then the quieter hi-hat samples on the next track, because I select them all, preserve those transients, and pull their envelope back to 30. And together they sound like this. And you can clearly hear that there's kind of a louder accented downbeat, and then 2 quieter notes following that. And again, realism is important, so they don't always land on the grid. And as you'll see with a lot of my samples, if you look down the right hand side, this group is delayed by 2 milliseconds, and some of our other percussion later on will also be delayed. We want to make sure that none of the drums are landing perfectly quantized together, because that's just not how a drummer would play it. So we've got these elements so far. The thing that's going to take you the longest is definitely the snare. So the snare groove originally sounded like this. It's great to use a marching snare to chop out all of the samples that you want, because you're going to have some accented main hits, then you're going to have some ghost notes and hopefully some buzzy rolls in there as well. This is what my drums sounded like, and then I'll break down how I went about chopping it up. So So what was easiest for me as a drummer was just to tap out that rhythm on the table and then program the drums to match that. If drums isn't your forte, what I would do is start with the main downbeats first and maybe try and copy another track. Listen out for those main snare hits, ghost notes, and then rolls. Or if you're creating these completely from scratch, create a rule for the ghost notes to land on maybe every other closed hi-hat. You'll hear it here. So in this rule, you're not often hearing a ghost note with the first downbeat hi-hat. With the snare, you're going to take it really slow, warping all of the beats individually. Some of the snares get cut off more prematurely than others, and I'm also taking pitch into consideration. I don't have an infinite amount of snare samples, so I have to double things up. So I'm taking velocity and pitch into consideration. These three samples are exactly the same. And they would sound exactly the same if I left them at the same gain and the same pitch. But as you can see here, they're warped a little bit differently. They have different gain values and different scent percentages. The snare is one of the few things, if the only thing, that has been EQ'd and then had Valhalla vintage verb applied to it. Just 3% to give it a little bit more of an overtone like a real snare and to get a little bit of room reflection there. Just takes it from being a completely dry snare to something with a little bit of reflection and character. That's actually going to be the main body of our drums. And it's going to be fine, but once we add the music, there's probably a little bit too much space between each of our individual hits. What we want to do is add all of the accidental stuff, percussion and toms. I want to tell you real quick about Spotify Canvas generators. See, to make my music really pop when it's on Spotify, I use a Canvas generator, and I only get that from, you guessed it, DistroKid. DistroKid make it super easy to get your music on over 200 platforms. And if you're not already a DistroKid member, you should use the link in the description below. You get 7% off your first year, and it's a wonderful way to support the show. Get to it, and I'll get back to the video. In a live studio environment, sometimes what we do is double up the percussion with just rim shots or sticks clacking together. So I've got some rim shots here that I've used in a particular rhythm as well. I like the idea of them fading in and fading out, so there's some dynamic velocity to them. You want to combine that with your snare. Again, coming back to the right side, we've got some delay in milliseconds, but you don't want to be super surgical with this. Not everything has to land on the same transient. Otherwise, you're going to get some phasing issues, and again, it will sound robotic. But this will really enhance the drum sound and especially the snare sound as well. If you're part of the Patreon or ever had a one-to-one session with me, you know that I really care about creating a realistic environment for my instruments. So one of those things is imagining how the drum kit is being recorded. Is there overhead microphones? Is it close mic? How many microphones are on the drum kit and how many microphones are in the room? So one of the things that I've added is a little cowbell sound that might be picked up by an overhead that's fairly close to that percussive instrument. Double clicking, you can see that I've taken pretty much the envelope all the way down to take it from something that's really quite long with a lot of room sound to something that's quite short with no room sound. That's going to be amongst my kit, kind of a background element that no one's going to pay attention to, but add into the realism. The same goes for the shakers here that are panned. Make sure that as you're going through this list, you're panning individual elements. As a drummer, I like to pan my elements in line with how I see the drums, the hi-hat a little bit off to the left, the toms in the order that I see them. Other producers like to arrange their drums from the order that they would record them. So the hi-hat will be off to the right and the toms will go from right to left. The shaker here is panned a little bit to the left and is essentially backing up the quarter notes of this pattern. It's made up of only 2 samples. But I've also got this rattly percussion that just comes in twice in the whole mix, fading in and fading out. This is the accidental stuff that I'm speaking of, things that might be left in the room that might get picked up by the overhead mic because there's a live bass guitarist, for instance, and on a certain resonance, it kind of just rattles a little bit. Those things are really lovely to generating a really realistic sound. Let's put those together with my hi-hat elements. We're coming to the end, and these were stylistic elements that I heard in Xander's track. The toms are fairly important, as are the crashes, but the chimes and tambo here are just helping the narrative of the song. So we've got some chimes that are rolled off with the EQ8 here, a line delay to get them out of the way of the kick and snare, which are put in mono. They're ever so subtle, but they just add to a little bit of a vibe of the kit. As does the tambourine at the end. You've already heard so many open hi-hats, so this tambourine lands with the open hat at the very end and just adds a little bit more excitement towards the end of the loop. I've then got some toms that are processed in the same way as my main drum kit group, so we'll come back to the processing, but I've basically got two tom samples, one high tom, and again, I'm rolling off some of those transients so it's not as overtony, it doesn't have as much of a hum to it, and then a floor tom here, taken from the same sample pack so they're in keeping. These are pretty saturated, so I'm just EQing them, using them really sparingly and arranging them amongst the main groove, with the biggest fill coming at the end of 8 bars. Very simplistically, I've got 2 crash samples. This sample came with a kick, and I didn't want that in there, of course, so I'm just adding a little bit of a fade and the EQ8 there to roll off some of those lows, and then combining that with the rest of my drum kit, you're not going to hear the kick anyway. Sometimes drummers will kind of accent a snare drum with a crash, splash, or ride cymbal, so I've just got the little bell of the ride here. And that pretty much concludes all my drum sounds individually. Let's get into the processing. So on my main drum group, what I've got is the Waves H comp. Don't forget that Black Friday is coming up, so keep an eye out for all these wonderful Waves bundles. I'm also using the Waves Kramer tape just to give a little bit of saturation. So we're getting the clicky attack from the H comp and a little bit of studio realism from the Kramer tape. And then Lifeline Expanse is adding a little bit of saturation and a little bit of brightness, as you can see with the multi-band effect there. As I mentioned, I've got a main drum group here in the darkest purple, and I think that the toms are an extension of that, which is why you can see the same 3 plugins at the bottom there. So there we go, something a little bit different today, and I hope those live sounding drums have got you excited. I'm excited to hear your work over at the Discord, and don't forget we've got the subreddit now as well. Everything is linked in the description, including the Patreon and my upcoming music. It's been great to see you guys, and I'll catch you next time.